but we'd like to welcome those that are going to join today or that are viewing at a later time. And we're going to cover a few topics today where we've had some questions up front, and then I have a couple other things kind of in the hopper, if you will, if we run out of, if we've covered those others quickly enough. Also, I did go ahead and we enabled the question and answer panel. So if you're watching this at YouTube, you probably want to go over to the Google Plus page, because at the Google Plus page, you can actually submit questions over in the Q&A panel. So if you're not there, you're not sure how to get to the Google Plus page, usually there's a link on YouTube that'll take you there. But if that doesn't work, you want to go to plus.google.com/the plus symbol, Learn Light and Sound Sessions, and that'll get you to the page, and we can kind of interact from there. So let's see here. Rick is here with us today. Rick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Curtis.
You had a very good question. I actually like to lead off by kind of walking through your question. Do you want to go ahead and kind of articulate what that was?
Sure. I have a lav mic, the Rode wireless lav that I got after watching your video review of it. And I do talking head videos in just like a couple minutes on YouTube as quick tutorials along with a blog. And I've been recording with the lav, going through a lot of post-processing. Fairly happy with the audio, but I also have the Zoom recorder, the H5, which has the little clip-on shotgun mic, and I have other microphones as well that I could use as a boom. And the recorder is multi-channel, so it lets me record both the lav and the standalone mic and mix them together in post if I'd like to. It adds a lot of time to the workflow. And my question is it worthwhile, and am I going to get much better sound? So that was really what I thought you could spend a few minutes covering.
Yeah, you bet. I think that's a fantastic question. And I think it depends. And I think my experience, and I would definitely encourage you and anyone else that's interested in trying this to do some tests to see what happens. Incidentally, have you tried it yet to see how it worked?
Yeah, I've tried it. I've tried it with the microphone alone. I've tried it with the lav alone, and I've tried it with mixing a bit. The iZotope new version of RX5 on the standard version will let you, the de-reverb is standard now. So if that mic's a little too far away, I think the problem I had was getting a little bit too much reverb, especially because it's a shotgun inside in a room. But the de-reverb from iZotope seems to work well. I'm happy they put it into the standard version instead of paying the extra money for advanced, which is pretty pricey. And I think it gives a bit of a richer sound than the lav, but especially when you go with a wireless lav, it's fairly quick and you don't have to spend a lot of time.
Yeah. I would say that, yeah, it's definitely worth trying it, and it depends on a lot of factors. And the trick is it's kind of hard to predict exactly what you're going to get with that. And let me explain why. I'd like to, let me just pull a little something up here. I pulled up beforehand. And share. Okay. This is, and you can find this in lots of places on the web. I actually just did a search for phase cancellation. You can also look for phase interference. You can also look for comb filtering. There's lots and lots of stuff out there about this. But if we think back to the way that sound works, sound is represented typically with a wave. And what happens is there's often something called phase. And what phase refers to is where in its, I guess, actually, I'm going to use their terminology here. Multiple waves are in phase if their crests and troughs line up. So if the peaks and the valleys line up, then they're in phase. But if they don't, then they are out of phase. That is that they're at different points in their actual cycle. So the thing is that if you consider two microphones, each of them are capturing the sound waves, and they happen to be different distances from the sound source, you can get this phase shift. And so one microphone, say for example, the lavalier, will be capturing this red wave, whereas the shotgun or other microphone may be capturing this blue wave, just again for illustration purposes. Well, that in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, but what happens is as you combine those two, if you were to mix the two microphones together, things can happen. So for example, if they happen to be in phase and you mix them together, you're going to end up overall with a waveform that's essentially amplified, that the amplitude is increased. If, on the other hand, they're perfectly out of phase and you mix them together, they actually cancel each other out and you actually get no sound. And in fact, this is the principle that's used in noise canceling headphones. So what those noise canceling headphones do is they actually have a microphone or some way of listening and capturing the sound outside of the headphones, and then they apply an inverse wave inside the headphones to cancel that noise out. So it's kind of an interesting thing. What that means in this case, though, typically when you're recording with two microphones, they're not going to be perfectly out of phase. They're going to be shifted some, more like this upper diagram up here. And what happens in those cases is that some of the waves will probably be amplified once you've mixed them together, and some of them will actually maybe be attenuated some. So the sound actually may change. And it's really kind of a subjective question as to whether it will improve or not. I find that oftentimes it doesn't improve, but again, it really depends on the situation. It depends exactly how far the mics are from the sound source relative to each other, and a lot of other factors. This is also sometimes called comb filtering, and over here at Sound on Sound, which is a great website, by the way, if you're interested in audio. It's mostly focused on music, but there's lots and lots of great stuff over here to learn for anyone that's interested in recording sound. But this fellow here wrote an article. His name is Paul White. He actually wrote a book on mixing as well that I've read that's really, really good. Again, focused mainly on music, but a lot of good things that can be learned from that. He calls it comb filtering, and what that means in specific terms is that when you get these out of phase waveforms and you mix them together, you get this effect called comb filtering. And the effect looks something like this if you were doing some sort of EQ, if you were going to do the equivalent thing that the waves are doing to themselves. With an EQ plugin, it actually has some sort of effect like this or something like it. And it can actually be somewhat destructive. It can be an effect that you want. It really depends. If it comes out and it is sounding richer to you, I always say go with your ears. If your ears are telling you this sounds better, then definitely do it. But if you're finding and you're scratching your head and you're like, well, I'm not sure that sounds better and it kind of sounds weird or sounds different, it may actually be doing something like this. So I would say definitely experiment with it. I would say that out of the gate as a kind of a standard practice, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And in fact, in most productions, they will use a lavalier mic and a boom mic for each person within the scene or the talking head video or whatever it happens to be. However, in post, they'll typically only choose one of them. They won't typically mix both of them back together, in my experience. So I hope, Rick, that was kind of what you're looking for, if that kind of answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So I'm curious, have you tried it? And when you did try mixing both mics together, what was the effect? Did it seem better? Did it actually sound richer, or what happened?
Yeah, I think it did, because I tried it before. I had it was before I got the wireless system, and I had a wired lav, and I had that. And I'm not sure really the quality of that little clip-on. Zoom calls it a shotgun mic for the Zoom. I think goes on the H5 and the H6.
Okay.
But it does seem to have a little more bass response than the lav, which would make sense because of the size of the microphone. And I mean, I've used that alone. I've used that, and when I tried mixing it together, I thought it made it sound a little richer, but once you put up that slide with the phase and in and out, well, yeah, if I had that shotgun mic a little closer or a little further away, that's going to screw up all the phasing, and then signals bouncing around a small spare bedroom too is going to make that. So yeah, but I'll play around with it some more, and with RX and some of the other iZotope tools. It as you know, you can play along with it endlessly and never ship anything. So
don't get caught in that trap. We all do at some point, I guess. Yeah, and again, like I say, it's definitely worth experimenting, because it can work. The trick is going to be that if you find that on one recording where you do it and you do record with both mics and you mix them together and it does give a richer sound, the biggest challenge is reproducing that the next time you shoot, because they may be just a little farther apart or a little bit closer, and things can change dramatically just in one shoot.
It's the same as when you're in post-processing in Audition. If you just add effect after effect and not doing a rack, and then you do the next one, you say, well, what did I do?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What did I do? I because it does, once you open it back up again, it doesn't show you all the effects that you used, and you can't undo it the next day and go back and duplicate it for another project.
Yeah, exactly. Well, good. Thank you, Rick, for that. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you, Curtis.
I betcha. All right, we do have another question. So I think I'm actually going to go over to the question here from Larry. Let's see here what Larry says. Larry says, can you talk about the Tascam DR70? I have one and I'm using it with a Rode VideoMic Pro. I'm not getting the amount of sound I expected from it. Could it be a simple gain control increase from mid to high? Okay. And then he also followed up, Larry, here. Incidentally, I purchased the DR70 simply to monitor the audio while shooting with a Canon 70D. Love the camera, but hate the audio output. Okay. All right. That's a good one, Larry. So I would say with the VideoMic Pro, the VideoMic Pro has a 3.5 millimeter TRS plug. And I assume that you're plugging that into the 3.5 millimeter input on the DR70D. And you may have already done this, so this is just a sanity check to make sure that we've got all the right things checked, but there is a menu item under System, I believe. I use a 60D Mark II, and I think the menus are the same, but if you go under System, there is an option for plug-in power, and that needs to be turned on. So if you could just confirm that, first of all, that'll be the first thing that you'll want to double check. And that kind of trips a lot of people up because it doesn't work out of the default setting is off. So anytime you plug in a mic that needs, although I don't know that that one needs plug-in power because it is self-powered. So in any case, something to check there. From there, you do have the gain settings in the, I believe it's called the record menu. Again, I could be wrong. I'm just doing this from memory. I don't have my Tascam here in front of me. But yeah, you may need to change the gain. But I found that the VideoMic Pro has actually a pretty strong output, at least the newer version that came out earlier this year. I have that version of it, and the output signal is quite strong. And if you do need to increase the output signal, I wouldn't hesitate to use the gain on the mic itself. There's that plus 20 dB. I believe it's 20 dB on the mic itself, and you can increase that. But you should easily, with that combination, the DR70D and the VideoMic Pro, you should easily be able to get your peaks somewhere in the the -12 range without a problem at all. So I would check those things first. Also, I guess it depends on what you're recording. I assume it's dialogue that you're recording, and I assume that you have the microphone, ideally within about 40 to 60 centimeters from your talent, again, just boomed outside of the frame. Ideally, if you're mounting it on top of your camera, then things can be different. That really depends on how far you are from the camera. So there are lots of factors there, but that would be the first thing I'd look at, Larry, to see if that makes a difference there for you. All right, and then again, if you want to go ahead and confirm that here in the Q&A, we can do some follow-up on that as well. All right. The other topics I was going to cover here. The first one is, and actually we may come back to that. Oh, yeah, I know what I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about mixing a little bit. I think if you've been following my channel a little bit, you know that I bought a Zoom F8 field recorder fairly recently, and that's an interesting device, and I think that it's interesting because I think pros are looking at that device and kind of critiquing. And if from their perspective, I think it's very different than someone who's doing a smaller production. So I wanted to talk about that one a little bit because I think mixing is kind of the key there. So if you're a production location sound mixer, usually you're working in a larger crew, and there's going to be a separate post-production team, and your job is to capture the sound and then also to deliver not only isolated tracks, so you need a track for each of the microphones that you're capturing, but you're also typically going to deliver a stereo mix track. And the purpose of that is that on relatively large budget, or anything with a budget, I guess, if they don't have a really quick turnaround time, often what will happen is that stereo mix track will be used by the editors to do the initial cut of the piece, whatever that may be. So they'll get all of the audio tracks, but they're really only going to sync the stereo mix track to the footage that they have, and then cut to that. And then they'll hand it off at some point to someone who's going to work on sound, who will then potentially replace those with the isolated microphone tracks if they think the sound is better in those cases. So that's kind of what the whole thing with mixing is. And so when you talk about a mixer and a location sound person, or even a studio sound person, what you typically are capturing are isolated tracks for each of the microphones. So that's where you set the gain level for that track, and pretty much that is what gets recorded to the recorder for that track. But in addition to that, and that goes for every one of the microphones that you happen to be capturing at the time. So then there's also a mixer potentially connected to that whole audio chain somewhere with linear faders, and you've seen those before, where you've got a mixer board you've got gain knobs at the top, you've got a lot of other stuff, potentially EQ, and then you've got a fader at the bottom, which lets you kind of cut back to attenuate that signal for that particular channel, that particular microphone. So that's how you make a stereo mix track. So again, the isolated microphone tracks are getting recorded straight without any effect from the mixer, and then there's a separate mix track that gets all of the changes that you make on the mixing board, including any sort of attenuation you do with those linear faders. So that's an important distinction to make. And the reason I'm saying all this when we're talking about the Zoom F8 is that my impression so far is that, number one, the Zoom F8 is really not a mixer. It's not, even though it has an iOS app, and there's some issues in the episode that I have coming out here pretty quick. There's some issues with that iOS, the iPad-based mixer, and mixing with a touchscreen on that. And I don't want to get too much into that, but I think really the question for you that I wanted to kind of talk about here today is, do you really need to be mixing when you're filming for your particular projects? So just you need to understand, in the pro world, they are mixing, because typically that mix track, if it's a quick turnaround, they may actually use that stereo mix track as the final audio on the piece and go with it if there were no major problems with it. On the bigger productions, they will use that just as sort of a holding place in the initial edit of the film or video. And then they'll have the sound designer come in later after the cut, or after at least the rough cut is done, and they will replace all of at least the tracks that need it, they will replace with the isolated recordings. So that's just a little background on mixing and how that kind of works based on my experience, and something to consider as to whether or not you really need to be actively mixing. And that can inform which devices you need to buy. If you're talking about gear and what you need to acquire, do you really need a Sound Devices mixer recorder? So like the 633, which is a 3-input, actually has 6 inputs, 3 microphone preamplifiers. But the main interface on that one are these relatively large knobs. And in fact, let me just pull it up here and show you really quick. Take me just a second. Okay, let me share this with you guys. Okay, there we go. There's some faders right there, some mixing boards. But let me show you, for example, the 633, which is one of their smaller recorders. If you look at the device here, so these big potentiometers here are actually the faders, and these small potentiometers, these up here, which are you can recess these are the pan controls. And these are also recessible here, these little gray potentiometers. These are the gain trim. And then on the Zoom F8, it's kind of a different story. Come back to that while that's pulling up. So that's the difference here. And this device, you can see just ergonomically, it's really all focused on, obviously you have to set the gain at some point, and that's what you do in your sound check up front, get the gain level right. But then once you've done with that, you essentially push this button in and it gets out of your way. And then you use this one right here to do the fading. So this device is really focused on mixing. And that's what pro devices are all about, because most pro location sound engineers need to deliver that stereo mix track in addition to the isolated tracks. Over here on the Zoom, Let's see here. Here's the F8. Take a closer look at that. These potentiometers here are gain trim. These are not faders. And the way that the fader works is kind of funky. You have to use the jog dial here on the screen to select the fader, and then you can control the fader. But these remain gain trim knobs. So these aren't really made for mixing. These are made for setting your initial gain level and just leaving them there. But then they do have the iOS app, and let me show you that. I assume they have a picture of it here somewhere. Here it is. So you can see on the app, then of course you have the gain trim knob still. You can control it from the app if you want to, but then you have the linear faders. And all of the changes that you make on these linear faders affect the overall stereo mix, but they do not affect the individual isolated tracks that you're recording again. So that's just something to consider, that, if you were somehow getting the urge to purchase a professional level recorder and you had $3,000 or $3,500 sitting around, but you're doing projects where you just have really two mics for an interview, say, for example, or even just a talking head, as long as you get your gain levels right and those people aren't making massive changes in terms of their volume, then you probably don't necessarily need to be doing any sort of mixing during the production. So that I think is something that a lot of us don't think about. We just assume that these pro level devices sound 20% better or 60% better. And I don't think it's so much about that, because frankly, with the Zoom F8, I've used the Sound Devices 744T recorder in the past. And then of course I've used the Zoom F8 now for just a little over 2 months. And I would say the preamplifiers in the Zoom, to my ears, sound every bit as good as the 744T's preamplifiers. So even if we come back in here to the recorders, just so you see what that one looks like, sounds every bit as good as this recorder right here. So I think really what you get to when you move up into these pro level devices, especially the mixers, these again are very focused on allowing the sound engineer to actually create that stereo mix track, which is a very important deliverable when you're on a professional gig and they're going to, whatever kind of timeline they have and however they're working, oftentimes they're going to want that stereo mix either to use, ideally, so they don't have to do any sound, massive sound post or sound design or, any sort of kind of in-depth dialogue editing if they've got a quick turnaround, or just as a holding kind of placeholder audio when they're doing the initial cut. So I think I beat that one to death, but I wanted to kind of highlight some of those differences there. My goal was here to, first of all, help make sure you understand how mixing works for location sound engineers, but also to help inform you about what it is you get when you move up to a device like this over one that costs, about less than a third the price. And that, of course, also applies to the Zoom Handy recorders. I don't really find them like really strong for mixing because, again, for example, on the Zoom H5 here, this is a gain trim right here. This is not a fader. So there we go. Okay. Let's come back here. Looks like Larry responded. Thank you, Larry. Yes, you're recording dialogue, and yes, working within 40 centimeters. Okay, great. Yeah, so you'll just want to double check that. It's called plug-in power. So if you go check in the menus, if you get that turned on and do some more testing with your setup there, which will be, of course, your, let's see, I think you said a VideoMic Pro and your DR70D. And I think you should be able to get a level that's going to work well for you. Again, if you have to increase the gain, you have two options. You can increase it on the microphone itself. There's a little switch. You can go 0 dB plus 20 dB if you need to increase it, or I think you can also go minus 10 dB if I remember right. So those are your options there. So you'll want to experiment to see which one gives you cleaner gain. It may be that using the microphones plus 20 dB will work out well, but then you can also increase the gain. And for the 3.5 millimeter input on the Tascam DR70D, I believe that your options in terms of gain on that are, I believe it's either low or high. I don't think you have any other options than that. But again, you can experiment there. And then you also do have, actually, you do have a fader on the Tascam DR70D, so you can use that as well. All right. That covers those topics. If anyone else has questions, Rix, do you have any other questions or thoughts or things you wanted to talk about? Kind of took you by surprise. You're probably muted.
Okay. I am unmuted now. Yes. No. You answered the question, so that's great. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. All right. If anyone else has questions, we've got, again, that Q&A panel is open, so we're welcome. Invite you to come over there if you've got any questions. We'd love to hear anything that you've got over there. I thought what I'd do too then is, let's see. I'm actually working on my final review of the Zoom F8. I don't know if that's of interest to any of you, but a couple of things. They did release their first firmware update, so that's great news. And there's not anything that's absolutely critical in it as far as I was concerned. It seemed like it was just a couple of bug fixes in cases where I hadn't experienced the issue. So I think one of them was that if you used an especially large SD card, in some cases that card couldn't be read on the computer once you went to go import the audio on your computer. So they fixed that issue. And then there was another one where in some cases the unit didn't turn on. I never experienced that. So it's great to see that they are on top of those things and releasing firmware. I am looking forward to them addressing a few sort of functional issues that I see with the whole thing. So I want to talk about that just a little bit. Now, first of all, for the Zoom F8, for those of us doing relatively small productions, I mean, this is probably more than most of us would ever need. And I'm not actually showing it. I got it on the screen here, but I'm talking about it, but you guys are looking at me. Sorry about that. Okay. So the F8 is, again, for those of you that aren't as familiar with it, it does have 8 microphone preamplifier inputs, and you can also bring line level into each of those. So you have a lot of flexibility. Again, I have never shot anything with more than about 4 microphones at a time. So for me, this is plenty. If you've seen some of my episodes before, overall, I really love this device. There are a couple of things that make it, I think, so that the professional sound mixers are not as in love with this device as they may be with others. And I think they're very valid concerns. So a couple of them, if I could point those out, let's see here. First of all, as I mentioned before, you can't mix with just the device itself. You really have to use the app that comes with it, which is down here. Again, that right now is only on iOS, so you can only use it on an iPad or an iPhone. So for the Android users out there, the question was asked of Zoom within the last month or so, whether or not they were planning an Android version of the app, and their answer at that point was, as of this time, we are not. However, we're taking customer feedback, and we may, in essence, they may do it in the future, but they don't have any current plans to do it. So I also found that mixing on this interface is pretty tricky. And I can't really show it to you here, but I can tell you with my experience is that anytime I went to go operate one of the faders, just sort of finesse it down a touch, as soon as I put my finger on the screen here, it jumped down 4 decibels. Now, I don't know if that's just because I have very large hands and fingers, but that was problematic at a very practical level because you couldn't really finesse. I mean, as soon as you change something by 3 dBs, there's an audible difference. And typically the idea with a linear fader is that you can very smoothly kind of cut it back without being too obvious about it. So that was the first kind of issue I experienced with the app here. And I want to be very clear, I very much support Zoom, and my hat's off to them for creating this app and putting the Bluetooth functionality within the recorder so that they could do that. I think that's fantastic. But however, what I am saying is that it's not a perfect app. I don't know if there's something they can do to change the app so it's not so fidgety or jumpity like that. But mixing on a touch screen is never quite the same as mixing with a tactile physical fader. So that's one thing to keep in mind again. And I think that mainly affects the professionals that do have to deliver a stereo mix track. Again, for someone like me who is doing corporate pieces where I am kind of usually the only guy, sometimes I have an assistant with me. I do a sound check up front and get the gain set for each of the microphones. But then pretty much once we start rolling, I'm not usually mixing, and I'm not usually creating a stereo mix. So for my own pieces. At some point in the future, perhaps, when I'm working on it with a bigger crew, I'd love to do that. But again, something to keep in mind there. So that's where I think the professionals don't necessarily see this as a device that's as viable for their work, but that doesn't mean it's a bad device, and it also doesn't mean that it doesn't sound amazing. So it doesn't mean that the preamplifiers are bad. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Some other things I found with it as well, that, you know, I think this affects everybody. The great thing is that they have included, you can see here, this connector. Don't know if you can see that, but that's this one here above input number 4 is what's called a HiROS input. And that is actually for bringing an external battery to power the device. And actually I use that. I have an Anton Bauer gold mount battery that has a DTAP little kind of connector, and I can connect it up here to the Zoom F8. And with one charge of that battery, it's a large battery. This is not, if you're thinking AA size, it's probably about the size of 30 AA's, I would guess. But it fits nicely in my sound bag. And I'm able to power the Zoom F8 with that for approximately 25 hours. So even when I'm phantom powering microphones. So that's 2 full production days easily. And that's fantastic. And that's a really nice feature. Glad to have that. But if you're going to use the inbuilt AA batteries, it takes 8 AA batteries. Depending on the type of battery you use, I'm using Eneloop Pros in mine. And what I'm finding is that the battery life on that, if I'm phantom powering, say, maybe 1 or 2 mics, plus I may have a couple of other lavalier mics coming in that are self-powered that I don't have to phantom power, I find that when I'm recording with that, with the AA batteries as the power source, I'm getting probably more like 2.5 to 4 hours, again, depending on a lot of different things. So it's not like it's amazing battery life, and that's something to keep in mind as well. If you're going to go get all serious and get a recorder like this, out of the box, it's still, you have to take into account how much battery life you're going to get and what your strategy is if 2.5 to 4 hours isn't enough for you and what you're doing in your particular case. So just a consideration. Does that make me hate this device? Not at all. I still love it. And again, I'm using that large battery in my sound bag, so it's not an issue for me. Just one other thing to consider here. I did a piece, and some of you may have seen it over on my YouTube channel, about the limiters that are built into the Zoom F8. And in fact, I'm going to show you something here that will help explain this. Operation manual. We're going to download the manual here and take a quick look at this. Here we go. Okay, so here is the manual for the Zoom F8. Let me just scroll down here. While I'm doing that, I can also talk about the metadata entry. Metadata is what allows you to add information that kind of gets bundled in with the file. And it's really helpful to be able to do that during a production so you can keep track of what everything is once you bring it all into your computer. And that can be overwhelming. And especially on larger budget pieces, obviously there's typically going to be more footage captured. There's going to be a lot more sound captured, and keeping track of what everything is can be a real challenge. So having the metadata features is really nice, and I think they've made a nice first step. The metadata is entered. You can do it on the Zoom F8 itself, but it's very cumbersome because you don't have a keyboard, obviously. So you have to use the little jog controller dial right here to select each letter individually. That's very tedious and not, I don't think, very viable. Maybe in a pinch you could do that, but and here, in fact, here's what the keyboard looks like. So you turn the dial until you get the letter you want. You press in the dial, and then it adds that letter. So it's pretty cumbersome and probably not something that you want to do on a regular basis, but the iPad and the iPhone app allow you to enter stuff. So that's great. What you can change in terms of metadata is you can change the file names, and you can also add some notes. So all that gets bundled in with the file. That's all great. What's not so great is that you cannot name each of the tracks that you're recording. So for example, if you have 4 microphones coming in, it'd be nice to be able to say, okay, track 1 is the boom mic, track 2 is Lav 1, track 3 is Lav 2, so on and so forth. Well, you can't do that currently, which is a little bit of a frustration. So it'd be nice if they could add that. I would assume that seems like a software addition that could probably be done. Again, I don't know the entire architecture, so I don't really know myself personally, but hopefully, and I'm hopeful that Zoom will hear this feedback, that it'd be really great to be able to name those tracks so that everyone knows exactly what they are. You wouldn't have to have, take additional phone calls if you are delivering the information over to a post crew, or if you're doing the work yourself, just being able to keep track of, okay, which mic was on channel 1, which mic was channel 2. Having that it'd be really nice to not have to worry about that and just be able to enter that information up front. Okay, so back to the input limiter. Okay, let's see. So what they don't show on this diagram, so here's the input-output signal flow. And what they don't really show here, actually, let me see if there's another one. Yeah, let me just go back to that one. This is kind of nerdy to, these kind of diagrams, but it tells us some interesting information that's helpful in evaluating how well this will work. Did I pass it? Oh, here it is. Okay. So you have your inputs over here. So these are microphone or line level inputs. Over here, the very first thing that it goes through is this dual channel record. So if you turn on that safety track feature, which is really cool, by the way, and I'm really glad they included that. What that does is if you say, for example, are recording a mic on input 1, on input 4, it will also record that mic, but at a lower gain level. And this is actually all happening in the preamplifier before it even gets digitized. So this works really, really well. And that's a safety track from the standpoint that if suddenly one of your actors or talent gets super loud and it starts to distort in the main channel, you'll also have this secondary channel, say input 4, that's recording at a lower input gain level. And so it shouldn't clip and distort on that one. So that's a really nice feature. However, excuse me, what Zoom has done here is that everything after that point, I believe, oh no, there's the trim right there. So that's the gain setting right there. But I believe everything after that point is all done in the digital part of the signal chain. What that means in practical terms is the analog audio signal comes from the microphone into input 1. It goes through this dual channel recording if you have that turned on, and it amplifies it. And then it goes to the analog to digital converter, and everything else here is done after it's been sent to a digital format. The trick is that if you've turned your limiter on, what a limiter does is it tries to catch that distortion when someone gets really loud before it actually distorts the analog preamplifier. So before you even get to the digital conversion, or from analog to digital conversion, it tries to capture that and prevent that distortion from happening. But in Zoom's case here, they've implemented that in the digital stage after some of that distortion may have already occurred. So that was a little bit of an it's a little bit of a disappointment, I guess I would say. But I would say also on the balance side, it's not a total deal breaker for me personally. It'd be nice to have a limiter that worked before the audio got converted to digital and before that distortion took place. But there are a couple of other things here in the Zoom F8 that prevent that from being a problem in the first place. First of all, they have this dual channel recording feature, which again can help prevent those issues. Secondly, these microphone inputs are very high quality. They have a specified dynamic range of 120 decibels, which is actually very, very good. And in fact, most of the sound devices, recorders and mixers have a dynamic range rated in the about 16 to 18 decibel range. So it's very, very close. In fact, I guess technically, at least if you're believing the specs, the Zoom F8 does a little better. And that also is helpful for preventing clipping as well, because you just have a little bit more headroom. The preamplifiers can handle a larger difference in overall volume without distorting. So for me, those two things really kind of make the Zoom F8 still a very viable and very high quality recorder. So the fact that the input limiters are not awesome, they have these other features that still make it a very viable and useful type of recorder. So I thought that was something also that was kind of interesting about the F8 that I wanted to kind of include in my final review, which hopefully will be coming out in the next couple of days here. What else can I tell you about that? The one thing that I have not had an opportunity to test out is the timecode generator, because I don't have a camera that accepts timecode, unfortunately. Well, I do, but I don't have the add-on module that allows it to that enables the timecode. So let me just pull up something here. Let's see, Jose Frias, Zoom F8 review. This was a great review that was done by a professional location sound mixer. His name is Jose Frias. He talked a little bit about, whoops, let's come back here, the timecode features. So he actually has edited his review. his main issue, now timecode is a tricky thing. So if you're not familiar with the whole concept of timecode, let me first explain what that is. Timecode is an interface on cameras and audio recorders and other devices that allow you to sync them up. So what you do is you essentially jam sync them. So you connect the cable to both of them. Whichever device is generating the time code will send the signal to the other device and say, okay, this is the time we're at. I need you to stay in sync with this, and record that to your media, whether that be the video camera recording that into the video, or the audio recorder recording that into the sound. So that's what time sync's all about. So what that means is, in practical terms, is once you get back to editing, it's very easy to line up the two, the sound and the video, or sound and picture, as they often say, to each other, because they both have the time code stamped into them. And it's just a matter of saying, hey, sync these up based on time code. So the big question, though, is whether or not the Zoom F8 had a time code generator that was accurate, that it actually kept its time effectively over a period of, an entire production day, for example. So the folks over at Gotham Sound is a sound rental house in New York City, as I understand, for professionals that are doing sound capture for big budget or larger budget pieces. They did a test here. So they actually have this is the Sound Devices 788T, which is a renowned recorder from Sound Devices that has a timecode generator that is quite good. And then the Zoom F8, of course. This is actually inside of a freezer. So if you're wondering what this is, so here's a bunch of ice. They did a sync to both of them from a third device, namely a Denikey GR1, which evidently has one of the highest accuracies in the industry. They synced both of them to that, and then they stuck them in the freezer and left them there overnight. So it was 10 to 12 hours. And when they pulled them back out, according to Jose and the test that they did, let's see, the following morning, it was verified that the F8 was 2 frames ahead, and the 788T was 2.3 frames ahead of the GR1. So they were, the Sound Devices and the Zoom were off by 0.3 frames, so 1/3 of a frame. So in pretty harsh conditions in a freezer overnight for 10 to 12 hours, they maintained their sync pretty nicely. That's actually quite impressive. So what that tells us is the Zoom F8's syncing capabilities, its timecode generator and clock, are actually very, very good. So I think it's actually probably acceptable for most professional use. So that was an interesting thing as well. Again, not something I had a chance to test myself individually, but that was something I was curious about. So in the future, if I do move up to a camera that does time code, it'll be really great to be able to use the Zoom F8 with that. All right. What else do I have about the Zoom F8? I said I've covered this kind of in the initial impressions, but just the build quality is really, really nice. It's rock solid. I mean, the whole body here is a very hard aluminum. It's thick too. It's a plate of aluminum that's quite thick. The control knob here is fantastic. It's much better than the Zoom products from the past, the handy recorders. They were always a little, like in the Zoom think it was the H4 was the first one that had it. The H4n has it. The H5, I believe, has it. And I know the H6 has it. It's that little kind of dial on the side that you use to navigate the menus and stuff. And being entirely honest, I was never a fan of that. It made moving through the menus kind of slow. But this one is super fast. I mean, you just twist it and push it, and it's very solid. It's solid metal, feels very good, and it works really well. So definitely in terms of build quality, pretty solid. The only complaint anyone's ever had that I've heard about the Zoom F8 is the AA battery caddy is made out of plastic. And I could see if you drop that, there's a pretty good chance that thing would break. I know Zoom is working on making some replacement parts, so you could potentially buy that. So there's that. Oh yeah, one other thing, I did use it as an audio interface as well. By that, what I mean is that I used it as, you can actually hook it up to your computer and record directly into your computer with it. And it worked well for that. I'm on a Mac, and I didn't need to install any drivers, and I could record directly to the computer up to 8 channels, no problem at all. And that was really nice. The only thing I didn't like about it as an audio interface, so I thought, well, it'd be really cool if I could use this as my audio interface as well. But the problem is this, and let me get one of the pictures that show you. These are the main outs, the left and right channel outs. And that's fine because they give you these cables here that convert it from the whatever this connector is. Is it TA3? Is that what they call them? Don't remember, but they're kind of a mini XLR and then you have the XLR. And I hooked my studio monitors up to those. The problem is you don't have any way to control the volume on these. So then you have to use the volume control on your monitor. My monitors actually aren't set up for that. So there was no real way to control the monitor volume. So from that standpoint, I don't think the Zoom F8 on its own is really great if you're going to use it for driving studio monitors. So that's something to keep in mind. But if you're just going to use headphones into the 1/4-inch headphone jack, it'll work just fine. So again, for me, I don't think this is really a replacement for my audio interface, but it's nice to know that I have that capability if I need to. And if you just look on the other side, it's just has a USB mini input. And this is what you hook up to the computer. Incidentally, one question I think will come up from some people is, can you use this USB port to power the Zoom F8? And the answer, unfortunately, is no, you can't. I believe that the voltage requirements are a little too high, and there's no guarantee that you can get that much voltage necessarily out of a USB connection. So unfortunately, that's not an option. I know definitely for the the Tascam DR60D Mark II, that's how I powered that, is through the USB battery pack into its USB input port. But the Zoom F8 does not do that. All right. I think that's all I'll cover here. I hope I'm not boring anyone. Hopefully that was something that you were interested in, but if not, we'll move on to other things here. Let's see here. Okay. I think we're good on all the questions there, so we don't have any new questions there. Let me stop presenting that. Okay. As far as upcoming things that we're looking at, you'll notice I'm trying to get to a schedule where we do 2 episodes a week on the YouTube channel, just to keep things fresh. And my goal there is probably one will be more gear related, and the second one will be more post audio processing related, just because I like to have that mix. But then I'll probably also mix in some lighting things too, so don't necessarily count on that 100%. But we're trying to work that way. It depends on the week and what else we've got going on as to whether or not we can make that happen. But hopefully we'll be able to do that. Larry, you had another question. Will you talk a bit about micro-documentary filmmaking and how to gear up for it? I'm contemplating a doc and want to ensure that the talent audio is professional. What basic equipment should be considered, and what are my options? Well, it's going to depend on the type of piece, of course. I'll share my biases here, and I will preface this by saying these are my biases and how I typically work on these types of things. In some respects, some of the corporate video pieces I do they're not really documentary filmmaking, but they are, in some cases, they're almost like narratives. So I have more experience on that front. I don't really have a lot of experience with, I've done a little bit of doc work, but not a lot. But I would say for a doc, my bias would be to go with a shotgun microphone that's boomed. So you're going to need someone that's operating camera and somebody that's operating sound, ideally. I know that you can't necessarily do that. If you're the only guy, you may have to just stick a shotgun mic on top of your camera and go for it. It's never the ideal situation, but it may be the only choice depending on what your resources look like as far as capturing that sound. If you are going to be able to be working with the talent a little bit more, it's not just like man on the street stuff where you walk up and start interviewing somebody on the spot. You could potentially use lavalier mics as well. Lavalier mics, I would say this, take a lot of practice to get the sound right. If you're insistent that the lavalier mic should not be in the actual picture, if you need to hide it, in other words. So there's a lot to that technique, and I still don't feel like I have that down perfectly. And in fact, on the last narrative piece I worked on for, it was a corporate piece, we had two of the employees of the company were filling in as actors, and they had never, they weren't professional actors. They hadn't done this before. So for them, there were, they don't know anything about microphone technique. They hardly know anything about acting or anything related to it. So first of all, we tried to put a lavalier on them. The woman was very easy to get her lavalier mic on. I just kind of gave her a quick tutorial and said, okay, I need you to go in the dressing room. We want to put the mic on the little strap in between the two cups on your bra, behind the strap so that it's not rubbing against your clothes. And I think we're good to go there. And so that's what we did for her, and that worked great. For the man, he was wearing a sport coat, and we tried a variety of different things. We tried mounting it just on the inside of the sport coat. He was not wearing a tie, so I couldn't hide it under a tie. We tried hiding it under his shirt. We tried various things. It was a Rode lavalier microphone, so I tried using Rode's Invisolav, which is a little kind of silicone piece. You can put the microphone in and then tape that underneath the clothing. That wasn't working. We were still picking up all this clothing noise. Every time he moved, there was all this noise from his clothes moving. And what we ended up resorting to on that, to be honest, was it was a dark sport coat. So I actually just put the lavalier on the lapel on the outside and it blended in pretty nicely. So it wasn't a glaring thing. It wasn't, you had to look to see if there was a mic there. But that's what we resorted to. So in mini docks, if you do have the opportunity to use lavalier mics, I wouldn't necessarily make it my default choice. I'd be careful about that because, again, if you only get one shot at it and you didn't get it with the lav mic and you didn't boom a mic in addition to that, you just got to work with whatever sound you did capture. So I would definitely be careful about that. And again, my bias would be, if you can, get a boom operator to operate a boom mic and be able to hold that, again, just out of the frame up, like you said, 40 to 60 centimeters away from the mouth of your talent. I think your DR70D is plenty good. I think the Tascam recorders, the DR60D Mark II, the DR70D are both fantastic recorders in terms of their preamplifiers. And I've been really, really happy with the quality I've gotten out of those. And I've been using those for about 1.5 years very happily until I got the Zoom F8. And typically I'll use that. I'll still use the DR60D if I just want to be a little bit lighter weight. And I do like the DR70D. I like the form factor. It's nice and thin. So it's pretty easy to work with. I like that it's not some big bulky thing. The DR60D Mark II, that's one of its downsides, I guess, is it's kind of made as this brick-shaped thing that you stick underneath your camera on the tripod. And I hated using it that way. And it was always kind of flimsy too. If you put the camera on top of it, the whole rig would shake. And that wasn't a good situation. So the DR70D seems to fix some of those issues where it has a slimmer profile. So it's a little bit easier to rig up. What other considerations? If you are using a boom mic outside and there's going to be any sort of breeze, you're going to have a solution in place for that. So I think in the course, we actually talked about using the blimp type covers or Zeppelin type covers, and those are invaluable. And yes, they're expensive. However, I would say that the Rode blimp is what they call their particular device, works very nicely. In fact, I used the Rode blimp and I used a Rycote Windjammer with, I don't remember the model number for Rycotes, but Rycote is, I think, very well known in the professional industry. And the Rycote worked great. And that was the one that I actually had for a while. But the blimp worked, the Rode blimp, which was like half the price or less, worked just as well. So it was funny because, in fact, Rode's product, the Rode blimp, licensed their suspension system from Rycote. So they're actually using the exact same technology as far as mounting the mic. So I would say if you're going to be outside and booming a mic, you're probably going to need something along those lines as well. As far as shotgun mics are concerned, I've worked with the one mic that I haven't worked with that I'd love to work with, but it's an expensive one, is the Schoeps CMIT 5U. I don't think you have to have something like that to make a good documentary. It'd be great if you could, or it'd be great if I could at some point, but I don't. But I've also used a Sennheiser MKH416, which is about $1,000 shotgun microphone. That's been kind of an industry standard shotgun for years and years and years. But again, in 2015 here now, we have so many options that are just as good or nearly as good as those. I've been very happy with my Rode NTG4 Plus shotgun microphone. That's about a $400 mic. The NTG2, which is about a $250 mic, is also very good. The Azden SGM250, another one that sounds very good for its price, which is again about $250. Those are all great options that I personally have used. And I think all of those would do nicely for a micro documentary. So I hope, okay, we got that. Larry just said, thank you for answering. Your course covers this, but I need to hear it again about basic equipment and techniques. So yeah, Larry, you're definitely on the right track there. I think you've got everything that you need to go forward on that. All right, we have just a couple of minutes left. Rick, I'd just like to kind of pause here. And again, thank you for joining today. Thanks for your question early on.
Okay, thanks, Curtis.
You betcha. And we'll go ahead and probably just wrap it up here. Thanks for everyone that was able to come hang out with us today a little bit. And again, if you've got any questions, go ahead and leave those down in the comments below, and we'll get another schedule out for next week. If you're, couple things in terms of getting notified for future sessions, 2 things you can do to make sure that you get notified for those future sessions. First of all, to follow me on Google Plus specifically, you want to go to plus.google.com/, the plus symbol, Learn Light and Sound Sessions. I had to move this to a different page because some of the regular YouTube subscribers were getting kind of confused about what are these hour-long things with Curtis in really bad lighting. So we needed to move it to a separate channel. So that's what we've done. So if you go there and follow me there, you'll be notified. Also, if you want to be notified, you can also just sign up at school.learnlightandsound. You don't have to buy the course, but if you just sign up as a student there, you will be notified for the upcoming sessions as well. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll talk to you again next week. Take care.